and welcome to the Tudor Her Story. Today I am discussing the Kenilworth Festivities with Corina Apostu. Corina Apostu is an independent researcher of Elizabethan history with a specific interest in the unique relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and her noted favourite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. She holds a master's degree in medieval and early modern studies from the University of Kent, as well as a bachelor's degree in history and medieval studies from the University of Toronto. She runs a website called Exploring Elizabethan History, which does exactly what it says on the tin. She is currently working on her debut novel, White Bear, Red Rose. Let's get into today's episode. Hello, Corina. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
How are you today?
Not too bad. I'm very tired. I was up a bit late last night, but otherwise doing all right.
So today we're talking specifically about the Kenilworth festivities. But
Mhm.
before we get onto them, I was wondering a little bit about yourself. And I was wondering, when did you first become interested in history, and when was it specifically the Elizabethan period?
Yeah, so I've loved history ever since I was a little girl, and my father bought me these like children's textbooks that were on maths, sciences, and history. So I ignored the math ones. I really enjoyed the science ones, but it was the history books that I absolutely devoured. And then, as time went on, I first became fascinated by Elizabeth I, specifically when I was in high school. And my history teacher put on Elizabeth I, the Golden Age, for us to watch and to kind of analyze. And I think our particular assignment was that we had to watch the Tilbury speech scene and then write an essay, or a short essay, mind you, on why we thought the director changed the speech, because it's not the accurate speech. I don't remember what I wrote, but I do remember being so enthralled by Kate Blanchett as Elizabeth. And I ran home and Googled everything I could about Elizabeth. And to this day, I joke that I owe my entire academic career to Kate Blanchett. But it wasn't really until my third year of my undergraduate degree. This is in Canada, mind you, so we do 4 years for undergraduate. So this is second to last year. I did a year abroad at King's College London, and that's when the obsession with Elizabeth really properly kicked in. I think I knew I was a hopeless case when I woke up at 7 in the morning before my classes started to visit Elizabeth's tomb at Westminster Abbey because it had been closed for cleaning the day before, and I was so gutted. I literally went to the guy and I was like, I really want to visit her tomb. Please, could I come back another day? And he was like, yeah, yeah, just come tomorrow. Come to the back entrance. You don't have to queue up again. I was like, that's so sweet. Yeah, that's when I knew I was hopeless. I was just utterly awe-stricken by this woman who was such a powerhouse of her time, and to walk a path that was so unthinkable to women at the time, a queen regnant ruling on her own. Certainly much of the path of the queen regnant was first laid by her elder sister Mary, but Elizabeth still carved her own path based on those foundations. And if nothing else, you have to admire how clever and witty and capable she was, even to hold the throne for so long. When you think of how high the stakes were against her and how much she was just up against in general, it's remarkable she even reigned for 45 years, never mind doing so quite successfully.
No, no, completely. I think obviously kudos to Mary being the first one to start, and she did have a successful reign in some aspects, but Elizabeth did keep it for so long,
Yeah,
and
it's,
she
it's
showed who was boss as well.
mind-boggling, honestly, when you think about it.
What drew you to Elizabeth's relationship, I say in air quotes, with Robert Dudley?
So that was also kind of during my year abroad in London when I first started reading more about Elizabeth's interpersonal relationships, and when I started delving deeper into the long companionship between her and Robert Dudley. It started off just by like reading blog posts on the internet by other people who were fascinated by them, and then I started picking up books. and articles, examining them, and then fiction books, and then movies and TV shows. And before I knew it, I was really far down the rabbit hole. What struck me most about the relationship was its sheer longevity, despite not having the legitimacy required by 16th century standards, marriage, and how that ebbed and flowed over time. And it was tested and strained, but it remained intact. Most monarch favorite dynamics end pretty quickly, or they end in disaster. If you were a king's favorite and you suffered exile, you would be considered lucky, But with Robert and Elizabeth, they were one of the few that endured to the end of their lives, and that makes them quite unique because you can literally see their relationship change and evolve without either one of them exiting the political stage in any way. I think it's also cool how the relationship, in a way, subverted 16th century gender roles. So here you have a female monarch and a male favorite, which was unprecedented for the time. You've had male monarchs have female and male favorites. Mary had close female friends, but Elizabeth being a female ruler with a male favorite caused an immense amount of anxiety, not least because it had dire implications for the succession if they were to, forget themselves. But having Elizabeth in the position of the master and Robert of the servant is a really fascinating dynamic that I just love to explore and pick apart because it was so fragile. A marriage, for example, could have easily flipped or threatened that. And I just also want to mention that in England's history, there have also been queen consorts who have been accused of having male lovers and things like that. But even that's a slightly different dynamic because that's a queen consort. That is not someone who is actually ruling the country, although in practice they certainly held a lot of power there. But having a queen regnant have a male favorite was something new. and I think a lot of people, I think a lot of the reason there was so much anxiety surrounding the relationship was just like, how do we approach this situation? It's so odd. But ultimately, I also love how much they genuinely cared about each other. Yes, there were politics, there was a love of power between both of them that may have occasionally superseded their well-being towards each other, so to speak. And there was some self-serving behavior from both of them. But a relationship like theirs does not survive for decades without that solid foundation of love. And if you look in the primary sources and see their interactions with each other, you can't help for some of it just to go, oh, that's really sweet. Yeah, it's just such an interesting story to me.
No, it is. I think, as you're saying, the dynamic is different because we're so used to it being like Henry VIII and a
Mm.
mistress or a favorite that he's got. And it's a bit like, it's not written in the book. What do we do if it's a queen and she's got a male favorite?
Yeah, exactly. You expect a male king to have female lovers. At that point, it was even expected for them to have male favorites. That's the rise of Thomas Cromwell and things like that. And that certainly in previous reigns, that also caused anxiety, like with Piers Gaveston, for example. But yeah, having even with male kings and male favorites, that still can't mess up the succession, no matter how much they would have wanted to. With a female queen and a male favorite, oof, the implications are dire.
They're too much to go through. Don't, please. Just get married, please.
Yeah, exactly. Make it simple for us.
So the Kenilworth festivities is they believe they happened in 1576? Am I
1575. Yeah.
1575?
Mhm.
Where did the idea for this festival kind of happen?
Well, basically, Robert had the ownership of Kenilworth Castle for a few years before 1575. Kenilworth Castle had actually been in Dudley hands before. Robert's father, John, Earl of Northumberland, had held it and had taken the first step in updating the castle. He had built new stables and widened the tilt yard or the jousting track. But obviously, Northumberland fell in 1553, and the castle reverted back to royal ownership. In 1563, the castle was then granted by Elizabeth to Robert shortly before he was raised to the peerage as Earl of Leicester. So he got the castle first, and then he became Earl of Leicester. And by the way, I will flip between calling him Robert and Lester because just my brain can't choose which one to call him as. So Lester had a pretty he had an interest in building and expanding his properties. And Kenilworth was something he had his eye on because I think it has such that like family connection. He wanted to make it this, you take this medieval kind of fortress. It was a very like military heavy castle, and I think he wanted to expand it into a sort of, I've used in the past the phrase Renaissance pleasure palace, but he actually did keep a lot of the feel of its like medieval roots. He didn't like change it into, Hardwick Hall, for example. But he definitely wanted to make it fit for a queen. He wanted to show off his wealth. He wanted to entertain Elizabeth. And yeah, maybe we'll kind of touch into this a bit later. It might have been something like, maybe I can finally convince her. Maybe this will be enough. And it's just to root his position as, the queen's favorite. And he had actually had Elizabeth there. She had visited 3 times before 1575. But in all 3 visits, they were smaller, obviously, in scale, and they were just kind of like a personal visit. And the castle was still in the process of being expanded. So I think as well, when all the expansions were finished, the Kenilworth 1575 festivities may have also been a way to just celebrate, like, hey, check it out. I've like doubled it in size. Let's celebrate. Yeah.
How did Robert plan this big event? Because obviously you said it, obviously he's expanded the castle, so it's a much bigger building.
Mm-hmm.
How did he plan such a long and large event?
Yeah. So he worked with a whole bunch of people. We don't know for sure the names of every one of them, but he would have worked with landscapers. He would have worked with poets. In particular, the chief poet, so to speak, that he worked with was George Gascoigne. I believe that's how we say his surname. He was a very skilled poet, and he commissioned him to devise a number of plays and masks to put on for the Queen. And he also commissioned him to write the official pamphlet that would come afterwards as sort of like, here's what happened at Kenilworth 1575. He also reached out. He relied a lot, I think, on his continental like contacts, so to speak. So he brought over Federico Zuccaro, who is an Italian painter. Robert, I think, was a big admirer of continental artists, particularly Dutch and Italian. And he had Federico Zuccaro paint 2 portraits, one of himself, Robert, and one of Elizabeth. We unfortunately, the full finished portraits no longer survive. They might have been destroyed in the one of the world wars, or they just been lost. But we do have the preliminary sketches, and they show both Robert and Elizabeth in full length. Robert is in armor, and Elizabeth is just in like her typical court dress, but there is a pole next to her with a little dog on it, which might have been a little nod towards a joke she had made about him once. She said that Robert is like her little dog, and that because he's never really away from her, and whenever she comes around, it's he must be nearby. It was a little bit of an emasculating joke, but it's kind of funny. And then obviously Robert in his suit of armor, he had aspirations to be the military commander in the Netherlands, which he did eventually receive that position, and it didn't go terribly well, but at the time he was really, really gunning for the position. So I think that portrait was clearly a nod towards that. But what was pretty audacious about this pair of portraits is that he commissioned them to be a pair, and he had them put up in Kenilworth next to each other, and it's quite reminiscent of the way they're designed, quite reminiscent of marriage portraits. The only real difference is that they're not facing each other. So in traditional marriage portraits, the couple face each other, whereas in these two, they're both facing the same direction. Although he might have been pre-warned ahead of time that this was a bit too far for the 1575 festivities, because I believe they were actually behind the curtain for the 19 days. So even with his confidence of like, I'm a unique in Elizabeth's favor, I could, I'm this close to becoming the consort. He still couldn't be that audacious about it. So
Do you, what was the reason, or do you think there was a specific reason for why Robert wanted to do this big event?
um so in terms of the ultimate reason as to why Robert wanted these festivities, the jury is still kind of out. It could be multiple reasons, and I do think it was kind of one. It was like the most obvious one, but then there is ones that kind of slot under it. So most historians argue that this was Leicester's last ditch attempt at asking Elizabeth to marry him. And there was certainly a strong theme of marriage throughout the entertainments, which we'll touch on later. But this late in the game, it might seem unrealistic for Robert to still have harbored any serious hope of marriage with her. Because at this point, her reign began in 1558, and then really gets going in 1559 and 60. So you're looking at now almost 20 years, like 15 years. But alternatively, it could have also been his way of asking her to let him marry someone else, because she was not willing to marry him, but she also wasn't willing to let him marry anyone else. And no matter as much as Robert might have loved her and might have wanted to marry her, he also strongly desired his own family and to build the House of Dudley again, because it had been absolutely demolished by Mary's reign. And his older brother Ambrose was married, but he also didn't have any children. Him and Anne Russell never managed to have children. And even though Ambrose is older, Robert kind of took the place as head of the family, just I think because of personality and also because he was much higher in favor with the Queen. So Robert has a strong desire to build that Dudley base again, and beyond that, beyond like building the power of his family again. If you look at the sources in like Robert's accounts and the way he interacts with people, he really seems to like children. Like he seems to be really fond of them. He's constantly giving money to little girls who give him strawberries. I think that he gave money to a little boy who slipped outside his window one day. He specifically was noted by when he was in the Netherlands that he treated the daughter of one of the officials there very, very kindly. Like he seems to have just a bit of a soft spot for children. So I do think he like personally craved to be a father, beyond the dynastic implications and whatnot. And so if he wasn't able to have that with Elizabeth, he would just have to find somebody else, but Elizabeth was not willing to let him do that. It could have also, as I've mentioned, been Robert showing off his completed castle and wanting to affirm his place as Elizabeth's continued favorite and close friend, especially now that his more virile days were behind him. And it's also been suggested that the festivities were a roundabout way of Leicester showing his desire and capabilities of being a military commander in the Netherlands against Spain. Alongside the theme of marriage in the events, there was also themes of war and battles in the entertainments. Personally, I think it was a combination of the first and last reason. yes, it might have been a bit of a long shot for Robert to think that Elizabeth might just say yes to marrying him at last. But he had tried for so long. I could definitely see him wanting to go out with a bang, so to speak.
Mm.
And then the message could shift from, well, if you won't let me be your king, at least let me be your commander.
No, I agree, because by the 1570s, he's not a young man, is he? He's
No, no.
40s, possibly.
I'd imagine so. Yeah, he dies when he's around 56, and that was in 1588. So yeah, in the
Right.
in the 70s. I'm not good at mental math, but yes, he's middle-aged at this point.
So you would be desperate for male heirs because you
Mm,
need to continue that line.
yes,
And
yeah.
obviously, we know Elizabeth didn't
Mm,
like letting anyone marry.
mm. Well, this is the thing. She didn't despise her ladies getting married. She hated it when they got married without her permission.
Ah,
Because in if they had her permission, if a lady of hers was keen on marrying someone and they were compatible and it made sense and there wasn't any issue against it, Elizabeth really had no problem. And often she actually celebrated with great joy her lady's marriage. For example, actually Ambrose Dudley and Russell, and was very close with Elizabeth. She had been in Elizabeth's service from a very, very young age. I think she was literally like 11 when she first was in Elizabeth's service. And Ambrose obviously is Robert's brother. Um, they had a huge, gorgeous celebration, and one observer noted that Elizabeth was so happy and was so joyful, you would imagine her own brother was getting married. So yeah, just off topic, but I just want to point
no.
that out there because it's a smidge of a myth.
Yeah, it do. I mean, obviously, I obviously believe the myth as well that she was like,
Hmm.
"No, you're not getting married. I'm not getting married, so no one else is getting married."
That's more true of her in like the last 5 years of her life.
Right.
The Elizabeth on her last leg, so to speak, was a very different Elizabeth to the rest of her reign.
I mean, fair enough. She'd been there for 40 years by that point.
Yeah,
She's probably
yeah.
had enough.
Yeah, and everybody kept dying, so it's just like you could get a bit crabby by the end of it.
So,
Yeah.
what did the festivities look like by the time he's organised them? Everyone's there. What was
Hmm.
the atmosphere?
Oh, in one word, extravagant. The information about the events come mainly from two sources. So, like I said, we've got George Gascoigne's officially published pamphlet called The Princely Pleasures at Kenilworth Castle. And there is a letter written by a man named Robert Laneham who attended the festivities. There's a little bit of uncertainty as to whether the person who actually wrote this letter is indeed named Robert Laneham, or if it was a pseudonym or something like that. For argument's sake, I'm just going to be calling him Laneham
Yeah.
for this podcast. Uh, these two sources diverge in detail or occasionally, but one has to remember that Gascoigne was commissioned by Leicester, and so his version is going to be more official and polished, whereas Laneham, in theory, is an eyewitness. And he's also approaching it from not a satirical lens because he's not making fun of the whole event, but he is being a bit more cheeky about it. So he might be talking about things that Gascoigne kind of ignores or glosses over, or it says something completely different from Gascoigne, and you kind of have to wonder like, which one's right? Who's telling the truth? But that's for the nitty gritty. Um, so Robert leaned hard into the Arthurian legend theme.
Mm.
He claimed to be descended from the legendary king, and conveniently so did the Tudors. So, for example, when Elizabeth first arrives, there is someone acting as the Lady of the Lake, like literally on this platform in the water. And the Lady of the Lake greets Elizabeth as she approaches, and mind you, if anybody has visited Kenilworth Castle, you'll notice that there is no water around at all except for the river. In the 16th century, during when this festivity was happening, there would have been a mere around it. A mere is basically like a man-made lake.
Right.
So the castle would have been surrounded by water. It isn't now, but you just have to kind of imagine that. So Elizabeth arrives. There's the Lady of the Lake on the platform to greet her. And the lady explains that she has been a guardian of the lake since the time of King Arthur. But now that the rightful queen has arrived, she surrenders ownership of the lake and the castle to her. And Elizabeth rather pointedly responds along the lines of, well, I thought I already owned it. Like oh, when I read that, I was like, oh, that's such an Elizabeth thing to say. Like I'm paraphrasing. She
No,
didn't say
but
exactly that, but that's the gist of it. I could not stop laughing. Um, Alongside the Arthurian theme, there were also strong classical imagery. On the bridge towards the castle, there were like these massive poles, I suppose, set up alongside it, each holding gifts that would be theoretically given by ancient Greek and Roman gods. So you've got like fruits from Pomona, wine from Bacchus, even fish from Neptune. I think, yeah, I know. Hopefully they kept replenishing them, otherwise that would start to stink real quick. Um, you also had like, I think there was swords and armor from, I'd imagine that was Mars and things like that. So it was just uh generally there was a sense of scale and grandeur. Like for example, instead of having just regular trumpeters play their instruments normally, Leicester had commissioned 8 feet hollow trumpeter statues for the actual trumpeters to hide inside and play from. It's just like every last detail was just like, no, 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 that's not it's too boring to have regular trumpeters. We're gonna make this interesting. The way I imagine it, maybe I've got the vibes wrong, but in my head, it almost feels like the 16th century equivalent of a Gatsby party.
yeah.
Like just sheer opulence and revelries and wonders and entertainments. Yeah.
It sounds a bit like Glastonbury, doesn't it?
A
Like this, just with
little
a
bit.
bit.
And I did always say I feel like Kenilworth Castle, they're missing a golden opportunity here to do like an annual festival recreating everything. That could bring in some money, I think.
You best drop them a line and let them know your idea.
Where are
Because
their
that
contact details?
getting on there.
Mhm.
How many people were there? Was it just Elizabeth and a few members of her court, or was it all of the court?
It was I would say it's probably pretty much in the entire court. It's hard to say for sure. We don't have those sorts of numbers documented, but seeing as Robert held feasts, dances, spent an enormous amount of money, and Elizabeth would have been expected to have at least her entire entourage with her, so her ladies, her porters, her, household servants and whatnot. I think it's safe to say it would effectively be the size of a small court at Kenilworth. And also worth mentioning that some of the events may have even been open for the local townspeople to witness and to see as well. So that obviously would swell the numbers. So yeah, it was bustling. It was a lively atmosphere. It wasn't like a private party or anything like that.
Everyone was there, everyone was
Mm.
watching.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What sort of events were planned? I know you've touched on them briefly, but were any specifically targeted at Elizabeth?
Yeah, there were a myriad of different events, and pretty much all of them were aimed at Elizabeth in some way because I think it was is it Janet Dillon, I believe she wrote a book on the use of performance in the 16th century, and she put it in a way as like Elizabeth was both the spectator and the performer, because a lot of the plays were created so that like the actors would turn and address Elizabeth, and Elizabeth would be expected to respond, and they would just riff off whatever she said. So yeah, there's nothing there that would have been like, oh, this wasn't meant specifically for the queen to see. No, every last thing was for Elizabeth to witness, for Elizabeth to take in and potentially even engage in. And of course, there was the usual stuff. So there's hunting, feasting, dancing, the usual courtly events. But there was also some time for the actual wheels of monarchy. So a few people were knighted. Elizabeth even went out to administer her touch for the king's evil, or would it be called the queen's evil now? I don't know. Engaging in what was a very pious and religious event. And I've written a small article before on Tudor Extra about Elizabeth using the touch to heal those of the king's evil, and she took that incredibly seriously. She didn't see it as just a PR event or anything like that. She prayed very intensely beforehand, and she truly put, her heart and soul into it. There's this idea that Elizabeth was kind of a, one particularly rigorous discussion away from being an atheist, but that's very much off the mark. She just wasn't she just wasn't effusive about her religion. It was very private to her. And mind you, despite all this revelry and whatnot, it was not hedonistic, so to speak. They still went to church service. I don't know if it was daily, but they went. They definitely went. So it was not all debauchery and sin or anything like that. But the true gems, in my opinion, were the masks and the entertainments. So you had like mock battles staged between the English and the Danes, both on land and on the water, going back to that military theme that I mentioned before. You had the water plays, which were probably the most dazzling and the most cool to witness. The probably the main one was the deliverance of the Lady of the Lake, put on by Leicester's Men. Leicester's Men was a company of players that Robert formed and patronized. I think they might have actually been like one of the first official ones. And fun fact, that was formed by James Burbage, whose son was Richard Burbage. I think I've got their names correct, who of course was a close associate with William Shakespeare. We'll touch on that later. So the mask involved a magnificent water platform where Elizabeth has to free the Lady of the Lake. See, this is what I'm saying. Like, she was included in the performances, who was held captive, and Elizabeth's mere presence is enough to do this. And once the lady is free, a water pageant appears with Proteus riding on the back of a wooden dolphin, within which, so this is a huge dolphin, musicians are hidden inside the dolphin and are playing music, and he sings along with the song. Like, it's absolutely insane. And when Elizabeth is out hunting so that was an example of the water pageant. Then you've also got, even when she's doing regular things like hunting, she's surprised by someone dressed as like a wild man, and this turns out to be George Gascoigne. He's dressed as Sylvanus, the god of the woods, and he starts speaking in verse praising the beauty and grandeur of the queen. This almost goes terribly wrong because Gascoigne accidentally spooks Elizabeth's horse and causes the horse to rear up on his hind legs while she's still on it. But thankfully, Elizabeth was a very skilled horsewoman, and she managed to get him under control and assuring everyone that there was no hurt. So, he was spared that disaster. At one point, there was even a sort of parody folk wedding that was performed. And I think this is one where kind of the townspeople were allowed to witness. And there was kind of a comical overtone, as the bride and groom were neither young or handsome. And so it was kind of like almost like a pantomime sort of feel to it. And Elizabeth was apparently watching this with Robert through her window, but she kept getting distracted by the dancing that was happening in her bedchamber. So you just have to, there's just always something to see. There's so much that you can't even focus on one thing in particular. And probably the most visually impactful entertainment would have been the fireworks. In the time before health and safety, Leicester could go all out. He worked with an Italian pyrotechnics expert to create fireworks that exploded loudly in a myriad of colors. And Elena mentioned that there were some that could dart into the water and shoot back out again, still burning. I don't know how that's even possible. I'm sure it is, but I don't know how. And there was even a fireworks display that shot out of a false dragon. Like, if you can find it, it's difficult to find because I'm not sure if it's streaming anywhere. But Lucy Worsley did a documentary where she and a group of experts recreated the fireworks, and she dressed up as Elizabeth and everything. It was so cool. So I don't know if we can find it anywhere, but if you can hunt it down, would highly recommend watching it. Um, and with this whole like explosive fireworks in mind, one wonders if this was also a nod towards Leicester's desire for military command. It's kind of like, look what I can do in peace, so imagine what I can do in war,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
No, I
Um,
mean,
oh,
no,
sorry,
sorry,
carry.
no, sorry. I don't even know what I was going to say.
Oh, bless. I forgot to mention one thing, and I cannot believe I did because this is to me the pièce de résistance, so to speak. This isn't an event, but my personal favorite part of the Kenilworth festivities is the private gardens that Robert made for Elizabeth's use. Though private, Lanham apparently managed to sneak in and explore and wrote a description of what he saw for posterity. So he mentions like endless flowers and greenery arranged carefully and neatly. There's Leicester's white bear from his album. It's like dotted here and there in the statue. There's a scent of cherries, pears, strawberries, herbs, and flowers. It's just such a you feel like you can smell it alongside him. And he mentions the aviary with exotic birds, the fountain in the middle of it all, which apparently had a splashing mechanism if you like press the certain, was it a button or if it got too close, but it would like literally spray the person if they got too close intentionally. Not, it was a feature, not a bug. It just sounded absolutely splendid. And we're incredibly lucky that English Heritage have now actually recreated these gardens, and to the best of their ability, of course. And you can go visit them yourselves now. And it's just absolutely stunning. I go to Kenilworth every year. It's kind of like a tradition of mine, a little pilgrimage. And I love that garden. They really have stayed as true as possible to the sources, where adjustments have been made where needed. The fountain does not splash people. Unless you're really trying, you're gonna have to like splash them yourself. And the aviary, there is still an aviary. There are birds in there. They are not exotic. They now house native birds, which I think is probably more ethical. So that's absolutely fine. um, it's just wonderful walking through them. They're so peaceful, and just imagining like Elizabeth walking through with maybe with Leicester arm in arm, what conversations must have passed behind those hedges. Would love to know. But yeah.
How did Elizabeth receive these festivities? But was she happy?
Mm, it it was overall a little bit of a hit or miss with Elizabeth. The hits were hits, but the misses might have really, really annoyed her. She clearly did enjoy much of it, as we have Lanham recording her enjoying the dances, the fireworks, hunts, and the more like humorously toned plays. In one of the water pageants, a man named Henry Goldingham was playing Arion on the dolphin's back. And he took his mask off too early and revealed himself. And so this was a gap. This was a faux pas. He was supposed to stay in character. Why he did this, goodness knows. Maybe he was drunk. Um, but rather than being annoyed at the lack of immersion, Elizabeth found it amusing. Um, and one can imagine that she adored the garden, especially as she so enjoyed taking frequent walks in fresh air. And seeing as she had been to Kenilworth before, it might have become a place of good memories before, a place of good memories in the past, soaking up the company of, the man she loved and just the gorgeous scenery that they find themselves in. Where her patience was worn thin was clearly when the entertainments became really overt in the theme of marriage. Um, One of the masks that got canceled was meant to be the biggest one, and apparently it would have been the most expensive one to produce. It would have taken place in an outdoor pavilion, and it was a story of a rivalry between Diana, the goddess of the hunt and a famous mythical virgin, and Juno, the goddess of love and marriage. Diana loses her favorite nymph, Zabetta, and is desperate to find her, only to find out that she has lost her to Juno. A battle of wits occurs, which Juno ultimately wins. No prizes for guessing who Zabetta might be alluding to. This theme was so on the nose. It's even been suggested that Robert might have been intending to officially propose upon its completion. Like that would have been the moment he would have actually asked her to marry him. Ostensibly, it was canceled due to bad weather, but seeing as Elizabeth left soon after this, one wonders if Robert pushed her patience a little too far.
So, how long did the festivities last, or how long were they intended to last?
The festivities overall lasted for 19 days, but it seems that they were meant to last a few days longer, perhaps 21 to make it a full 3 weeks. But Elizabeth, like I said, apparently left early. As she was leaving on her George Gascoigne once more surprised her with his Sylvanus Scott of the Woods costume, pleading with her in verse to stay, imploring her to, quote, command again this castle and the knight. Live here, good queen, live here. So it's very much like, please stay.
Yeah.
Please stay. Don't go. Laynon here, at first. Oh, actually, no, pardon me, it wasn't Laynon. It was Gascoigne himself who wrote this, which is interesting. Gascoigne had to run while spouting his poetry until so literally Elizabeth was riding her horse. He was running alongside, trying to like say all this poetry to her, out of breath, until Elizabeth finally reined in to let the poor man finish. It's unclear why Elizabeth left early. Perhaps that canceled Zabetta play had really struck a nerve and she had decided to leave early to make a point to Robert. Alternatively, she may not have wanted to continue to raise his hopes any further and wanted to spare him any further frustration. We don't appear to have any corroborating evidence for an argument or a spat, which is what most people assume. But we can't assume that with any certainty. We can't assume with any certainty that she left on sour terms. For all we know, they may have actually had a heart-to-heart in the gardens or something like that. And Robert finally got his answer, even if it wasn't the one he wanted. We can only guess. Still, it is the longest Elizabeth ever stayed at a courtier's house. So whether or not you consider it a success, you look at it from different lens. If it was to get Elizabeth to marry him, clearly a failure, wasn't a success. But if it was to cement Robert's position as her continued favorite and unique, close counselor and politician, in that case, I think it actually did the job quite well.
So, did Robert stay at Kenilworth once Elizabeth left, or did he immediately come back to court?
Honestly, I don't remember if he went with her to court. I don't think he went immediately because obviously I would imagine he had to stay back and kind of mop things up, so to speak. Definitely at one point, once he left Kenilworth, he kind of he didn't like never go back there again, but Elizabeth never visited again. And it didn't become his principal seat. He still stuck closer to London, like at Wanstead and things like that. But a lot of his art collection was there, and I think Kenilworth was kind of his getaway. It was because it was far from court and really, really gorgeous surroundings. But I do wonder if it was kind of like sour memories for him a little bit.
Are there any myths surrounding the Kenilworth festivities? Anything that's been said to have been there but wasn't?
Yes, I think there were a few. So there's a story that goes about a sort of pop-up garden for Elizabeth. The story goes that Elizabeth looked out her bedroom window in her brand new tower, which was created specifically for her and her ladies. And she complained that she couldn't see the garden from her view. So then Leicester commanded his men to work in silence overnight to construct a pop-up garden underneath Elizabeth's window. And when she woke up in the morning, she was absolutely amazed and so pleased, etc., etc. the issue is, I've seen this story repeated in secondary sources all the time, but I can find no primary sources support it. Lanham only mentions the official garden next to Mortimer's tower, and Gascoigne focuses only on the masks, so neither of them mention this pop-up garden. And if you actually visit the ruins of Kenilworth Castle and go up to where Elizabeth's bedchamber likely was, which by the way you can do, they've installed staircases for you to go up, which is so cool. Would highly recommend. So if you go up to where her bedchamber was, you'll notice that the placement of her windows would make it very difficult for any garden to be created under them at all. There may have been a third source for Kenilworth 1575, which has now been lost. It was called The Pastime of the Progress. So it's possible the story came from there, but even at the time of publication, it was known to be inaccurate. So it's not a super reliable source, even if we were to find it. So while it's a fun story, I don't think it actually happened, unless I'm proven wrong and we find a primary source somewhere. So that's one little myth. Of them all, it's probably the most harmless. um, the the festivities inspired a Scottish novelist in the 19th century, Walter Scott, very famous. And he wrote a novel inspired by festivities, but it's wildly inaccurate. In terms of full disclosure, I have not read it, but I have read about it, and I've seen people discuss it. It seems to kind of have its finger on the pulse of the English court. However, its content is absolutely off the charts bonkers. For one thing, Amy is still alive, and she's Countess of Leicester, which she never held that title because she died before Robert became Earl of Leicester. But she and Robert are in a secret marriage and that he's trying to keep from the Queen, and his evil squire has it out for Amy, and it was his squire who, spoilers, orchestrates her murder during the Kenilworth festivities, which is what brings them to an end, and then it leaves Robert in disgrace. It's a whole thing. It's definitely more fantasy than fact, but I'm told it's very well written from a creative standpoint. But just want to put that out there that novel is pure fantasy. You're not taking it as truth. Maybe one day I'll read it for fun and see what I think of it. And then the last myth that I kind of hear repeated a few times is that it's been theorized that Elizabeth left early because she discovered the burgeoning romance between Robert and Lettice Knowles, because they did, the two of them married about 2 years later, and they had friendly interactions before, some may even say flirty interactions. But I cast serious doubt on this. For one thing, Robert would be pretty stupid to risk flirting with Lettice during an event specifically geared towards marriage with Elizabeth. And for another, if there had been such a falling out, we would have sources to back this up, because knowing how sensitive Elizabeth was about Robert in particular, she was annoyed when anybody married without permission. But with Robert, it stung. It really, when he did it was personal. It wasn't political. So if she had discovered such a liaison between Robert and Lettice, they would have had a pretty explosive argument. We would have more than just Lanham and Gascoigne writing about it, and neither of them did. We don't have any sources to support an argument between them or anything like that. So for me, it just doesn't seem likely that happened. I mean, we can assume and have opinions on anything, but that it doesn't seem likely to me.
No, it always seems like Kenilworth was to woo Elizabeth, go, come on, you've been queen so many years,
like
yeah.
Make a decision or not, Yeah, I think that was it's now or never sort of situation. And then from that point onward, I think that was when Robert was like, right, okay, I need to cut my losses and I need to take a risk.
Didn't need your son in risking Elizabeth.
Hell of a risk.
What is the legacy of the Kenilworth festivities Do they have a legacy?
Yeah, so the Kenilworth Festivities inspired several works of literature, including two of Ben Jonson's. One is The Mask of Owls at Kenilworth, which was actually performed at Kenilworth for Prince Charles in 1624, as well as another one of his works called The King's Entertainment at Welbeck in Nottinghamshire. What a name. And of course, it also inspired Walter Scott's novel. But it may have inspired an even more famous piece of literature. Kenilworth Castle is only some 12 miles northeast of Stratford upon Avon, and William Shakespeare would have been around 11 years old in 1575, and it's possible he may have been amongst the crowds witnessing, say, the deliverance of the Lady of the Lake, because the years later, in Twelfth Night, he makes a reference to Arion on the dolphin's back, which could have been a direct reference to the mask that he witnessed at Kenilworth. This is just a theory and it's not provable. He could have also simply heard the Kenilworth festivities from his friend Richard Burbage, whose father James was in the Leicester's Men, formed the Leicester's Men, actually. Still, the possibility is quite intriguing, and if nothing else, it goes to show just how deeply entrenched Robert Dudley is in English history at this time. And I was obviously like, since he's one of my favorite historical figures, everybody's going to be like, more people should know about my favorite historical figure. But he really is so connected to so much that we don't realize. Like, for example, in the Stuart era, you have was it Buckingham who was a very famous art collector? Like there were some noblemen in the Stuart era who were famed for having huge art collections, and it's why to this day so many of them have survived. Well, the reason they had those art collections was because they used to be Roberts. So Robert was the first major art collector in the 16th century. Uh, for the longest time, I think a lot of his achievements and a lot of his what he's left for England have kind of been ignored, swept under the rug, or assigned to someone else because Robert has had such a poor reputation, largely undeserved, in my opinion. Well, obviously, he was not perfect. He was no
No.
angel, and he deserves some of the, dung flung at him, but not all of it. And I do think it's the history has done him a disservice, I would say. And I think it was Joanne Paul who said something along the lines of, if you do a bit of digging anywhere in the 16th century, you will likely find some Dudley connection. Like this, not just Robert, his father, his brothers, his sisters, like they're so deeply entrenched in the fabric of English history. But because their name has been dragged to the mud, it's not often highlighted. Or a lot of the achievements would have been because of the Dudley women, Mary Sidney and Catherine. But since they married into other families, they're not really considered Dudleys anymore. So yeah, that's my end of my little Dudley soapbox rant.
If you obviously you love Elizabethan history, if anyone wanted to research the Kenilworth festivities or learn more about them, where would you recommend they go and learn?
If you can get your hands on it. I've heard it might now be out of print, which breaks my heart if that's the case. But Elizabeth Goldring wrote a fantastic book on it. It's specifically on Robert Dudley being a collector of arts. So it's examining his art collection and the implications of that. But she goes into Kenilworth a lot and is a great source for those things. The book is called Robert Dudley and the Robert Dudley, Earl of Essex, and the world of Elizabethan art. Even if it is out of print, certainly you can probably, hopefully, find it secondhand on Amazon, or maybe if you're lucky enough to find them in stores as well. Really, really fantastic. For something more accessible, I would recommend any history that focuses on Robert and Elizabeth is going to touch on Kenilworth. There, as far as I know, there isn't anything out there that's, again, easy to find that is specific to Kenilworth. But I would recommend Sarah Griswood's Elizabeth and Lester. Really, really fantastic book that goes into their relationship. Joanne Paul's The House of Dudley goes into the wider Dudley family. She touches upon Kenilworth a little bit, not too much, but it is in there. Derek Wilson has done books on the Dudleys, one similar to The House of Dudley, encompassing the entire family, but one he's written a biography of Robert, which is also out of print. It's called Sweet Robin. Do you know what? Somebody needs to do an updated biography on Robert Dudley. Specifically Robert himself. It has been decades since we've had one. There's an opportunity here. And trying to think if there's honestly, best source I would say is, if you can, visit Kenilworth. They've got a really great guidebook. And there was even the name escapes me at the moment, but they made a book specifically on recreating the gardens, and that goes into Kenilworth history as well. So there you go, got a bit of a reading list.
So I've loved learning about Kenilworth. Obviously, I knew about the Kenilworth festivities, but not in much detail as you've wonderfully given us today. But before I let you go, I like to ask my guests 5 fun Tudor questions. So have you got a Tudor or Elizabethan pet peeve?
Oh, it's so many. You have no idea. If I had to pick just one, it's the myth that Elizabeth was constantly slathered in white lead makeup. So, fun fact, we have actually no hard proof she ever wore makeup. Portraits are not entirely reliable, as colors can fade, and in fact, it's even been discovered recently that the Darnley portrait, so the one where Elizabeth is in the orange gown, the very famous one, it's been discovered that she actually would have had redder cheeks. She would not have been completely pale, but that rouge has vanished over time. So portraits aren't entirely reliable. Makeup never shows in any of her inventories, and the only people who have ever described her wearing it are those who A, have never met her, and B, had an axe to grind against her. It's a myth that has strong roots in the Victorian age, as almost all Tudor myths do, as the historians of the time were really keen to compare Elizabeth unfavorably to Queen Victoria. You know, you had the childless, barren queen with Victoria, who had a whole army of children and who more safely filled the role of a wife and mother that a queen was expected to do. So the Victorians just kind of accepted these biased descriptions unquestioningly. And now because the myth has stubbornly won't leave our collective consciousness, especially because I think it was in the 70s, I might got that decade wrong, but Roy Strong coined the term the mask of youth. But he wasn't referring to her makeup specifically. He was referring to the style of her portraiture, the mask of youth, how there was a particular face structure that all her artists would follow. But people have taken that and ran with it and thought he was referring to physical masking, like a makeup and things like that. I'm not saying she never wore makeup, because we do know in the 16th century that Parisian, I can never pronounce it, but like that lead white makeup was used. It was used in the continent. It was seen in England as well. But if she had used it, it was not frequent enough. It was not enough to merit comment. And also, Erin Parsons, she's a makeup artist on YouTube, did a fantastic video on this, believe it or not. She delved into the history of the lead white makeup and its associations with Elizabeth. And she went to a chemist, and they actually recreated this lead white makeup using the historical recipe. Even if Elizabeth had been using it, it's not opaque white clown makeup. It's literally like if you can think of almost like a tinted moisturizer, and very pale and very pearlescent. It was gorgeous. It's a shame that it is so toxic. Like, because I'm sure if there's going to be makeup companies out there that can recreate it in a much safer way. But yeah, it was not this hideous thing. It was not a thing of ridicule. And so I went so on a tangent about this, but Oh, this myth annoys me so much because it's always used to like ridicule and make Elizabeth into like a sort of clown, and they do. So yeah, I don't like this myth.
If you could go back to any day or event in the Tudor period, when and where would it be?
Oh, Kenilworth Festivities. Absolutely. I've said this before. Oh, I would give anything to see the castle in its heyday because again, unfortunately, right now it's in ruins. It was destroyed during the Civil War. I would love to see the amazing displays that were commissioned, the crazy fireworks, the endless performance, the luxury and the indulgence. For me, it would be the equivalent of Disneyland. If nothing else, I would love to see it adapted on screen one day. Apparently, Walter Scott's novel had been adapted by the BBC, but that footage has now been lost. Although I think Owen Emerson found a link to it at one point, which is super cool. I'll have to see if I can find it again. But in terms of a modern day adaptation, we don't have anything, and I'm really shocked that there hasn't been. I feel like this is a golden opportunity here. I mean, granted, the production value will probably be a bit insane. It cost Robert oodles amounts of money, never mind somebody in the modern age. But I feel like there's an opportunity here, like period drama comedies, that's an oxymoron. Period comedies
Yeah.
have found a bit of a resurgence recently. If you look at like My Lady Jane and Catherine Called Birdie and things like that, I'm like, the period comedies are having a moment right now. I feel like there's a room here for making a sort of like, if you can think of like Shakespeare in Love, but Kenilworth. I think that would be
Mm.
so cool. Somebody make it, please.
Have you got a favorite history book? It can be fiction or non-fiction.
Oh man, it's really hard to pick just one. Well, to stay on theme, like I said, I'm gonna recommend it again. Sarah Gristwood's Elizabeth and Leicester. Fantastic place to start reading about the relationship between the two of them. In terms of a fiction book, um, well, I recommend this one hesitatingly. So it actually is one of my favorite books. It's called Legacy by Susan Kay. It was actually the fiction book that kind of kickstarted my interest in Elizabeth and Robert because it follows Elizabeth's life from like childhood to her death. And it has one of the most like electric dynamics between her and Robert. The dialogue is so sharp and it's so smart and it's so like the banter is out of this world. The reason I hesitate to recommend it is only because it was written in the 80s and it shows. It's based on pretty outdated research by this point. Robert is written a little too aggressively, in my opinion, from what we know of the real man. There are a few scenes that I genuinely hate, and I wish she hadn't included them. I wish she had rethought them. So I will warn people now. There are some scenes where I would just, if you know, you know. But ignoring those, I just love the way she wrote the dynamic between Robert and Elizabeth. It was like that push and pull, the moments of like you feel like they hate each other, but then they like make up again, and it's like you see that like they can't ever break this bond no matter what happens. And even if it can get like toxic sometimes, you see how much they care for each other. And there's a scene where Elizabeth is ill and Robert stays up all night caring for her. And by the way, that's based on an actual source that actually happened multiple times. In fact, once she had a stomach flu, and then the other time she had a toothache, and Robert stayed with her the entire night. Like that's husband level material, in my opinion. Yeah, so Legacy by Susan Kay. It's what started it all for me.
I know the answer to this before I'm going to ask it, but if you could invite any Tudor figure to a dinner party, who would it be?
Probably Elizabeth, to be honest with you. But specifically a younger version of her. I think we'd get on a lot better. I think older Elizabeth would intimidate the hell out of me.
Be a bit scary at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
Yeah, actually, I learned this one recently and it really amused me. Did you know that the first national lottery actually took place in Elizabeth's reign. It happened in 1567, and it was managed by Cecil with Elizabeth's approval to raise money for things like shipbuilding and improving coastal defenses. Um, and basically, it was geared towards only the well-to-do and the gentry and the nobility, because it would just be absolutely unaffordable for the average person. And what was supposed to happen is that enough people had to buy tickets to have a pool of money, and then the prizes will come from that pool of money, but then the rest of it will be put towards shipbuilding and whatever else. But tickets weren't drawn until 2 years later in 1569, and ultimately it didn't go terribly well as not enough people bought tickets because it was such a new thing and they weren't sure what the heck was going
What's
on
going
and
on?
if they would be paid. Like, because yeah, you're just starting
What is
out.
it?
What is this? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the pool of money to split from was smaller than expected. So they never tried it again. They shelved it. And the next national lottery didn't occur until I think the mid 1600s. But still, I can't help but giggle imagining like William Cecil doing one of those lotto adverts that you see on the TV. So like think about that next time you buy a scratch card.
Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing the Kenilworth festivities in such detail, and your enthusiasm really comes across as well.
Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed this episode and you loved all the others, please take the time to rate and review the show.